When an avoidant sees someone else wanting you, something shifts deep inside them. It is not loud, it is not visible. On the outside, everything still looks the same, calm, controlled, even uninterested. But inside, something begins to move that they rarely acknowledge, even to themselves. There is a moment most people never notice. It happens quietly, a simple realization that someone else is now giving you attention, value, and emotional presence. And in that moment, the avoidant mind does not react with open emotion. It reacts with resistance, with denial, with internal tension that they try to push away immediately. This is where the real psychology begins. Because avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion, they are disconnected from expressing it. They are trained by their own patterns to shut down anything that feels too close, too intense, or too demanding. So when they see someone else stepping into your life, offering you what they once had access to, something unexpected starts to surface under the surface control. A silent emotional reaction. Not strong enough to break their behavior, but strong enough to disturb their inner balance. And this is where the story becomes important. In this video, the focus is not on surface-level reactions. It goes deeper into what actually happens inside an avoidant's emotional world when they realize they are no longer the only source of attention in your life. There is a psychological shift that takes place. It is subtle at first, then it becomes more persistent, and eventually, it turns into something they struggle to ignore. There is a common misunderstanding about avoidance. People assume they simply stop caring when they distance themselves. That assumption feels true on the surface because their actions often support it. They pull away, they become quiet, they seem detached. But emotional detachment is not the same as emotional absence. Feelings do not disappear just because they are not shown. When another person begins to show interest in you, it creates a disruption in the avoidant's internal system. Not because they suddenly become possessive in an obvious way, but because their sense of control is challenged. They are used to being the one who defines the emotional distance. They are used to knowing that access to them or to you can be turned on or off at their comfort. That illusion starts to weaken, and inside their mind, something uncomfortable begins to form. Not clarity, not acceptance, but contradiction. One part of them tries to remain unaffected, repeating the belief that distance means indifference. Another part begins to register details they normally ignore. Your attention is no longer fully available. Your energy is not waiting in the same way. Your emotional focus is shifting elsewhere. This is not something they openly admit. It is something they process internally, in silence, often without fully understanding it themselves. As this internal tension grows, their behavior may not immediately change in obvious ways. In fact, they may become even more distant at first. This is not because they do not care. It is because caring feels threatening to their emotional defenses. So instead of moving closer, they often move further away in an attempt to regain control over their own feelings. But emotional reality does not disappear through distance. The awareness remains. It follows them in quiet moments. It shows up when they least expect it. It becomes a thought they did not invite but cannot fully remove. Someone else sees value in you now. Someone else is offering attention that once felt exclusive, and that changes the emotional equation in a way that cannot be ignored forever. This video will break down every layer of that experience. It will explain why avoidants react internally instead of externally. It will uncover the hidden emotional conflict between ego and attachment. It will show why silence is often a defense mechanism rather than a lack of feeling. And it will reveal why the presence of a new admirer can create a deeper emotional impact than direct confrontation ever could. There are patterns here that most people misunderstand. Moments of withdrawal that are not rejection, moments of distance that are not indifference, and moments of realization that come too late, after emotional space has already shifted. By the end of this video, the goal is to give clarity, not confusion, not fantasy, but a grounded understanding of how avoidant psychology responds when emotional access is no longer guaranteed and attention is no longer exclusive. Stay until the end, because the final part reveals why this internal shift often leads to regret that is never openly expressed, and how silence can sometimes mean more than words ever could in this dynamic. Welcome to the channel. If this content brings clarity to situations that often feel confusing or emotionally complicated, subscribe and stay connected. There is more insight ahead that can help you understand these patterns on a much deeper level. The avoidant mind builds a strong internal belief that emotions can be managed through distance. It creates a sense of control by stepping back before things become too intense. Silence feels like safety. Space feels like power. Over time, this becomes a personal rule of survival. If closeness brings discomfort, then removing closeness feels like control over the situation. In this mindset, emotional involvement is something to be regulated rather than experienced. When feelings start to grow, the natural response is to reduce contact, delay responses, or shift attention elsewhere. This creates an internal illusion that nothing can truly affect them deeply unless they allow it. They start to believe that by staying detached, they remain unaffected by emotional consequences. This belief becomes stronger when past experiences reinforce it. Every time they withdraw and the emotional intensity fades, it feels like proof that distance works. It strengthens the idea that they can move in and out of connection without facing emotional impact. Over time, this turns into a quiet confidence that they are above emotional disruption. But this illusion depends on one key assumption. It depends on being able to remain the center of emotional access in someone's life without challenge. It depends on the idea that attention, availability, and emotional space will always remain unchanged, even when they step away. The moment another presence enters that emotional space, the structure begins to shift. The control they believed they had starts to feel less absolute. Attention that once felt reserved becomes divided. Emotional availability that once felt constant starts to change direction. And for the first time, distance no longer guarantees emotional stability in the way they expected. Inside this shift, the foundation of their control does not disappear suddenly. It begins to weaken quietly, through realization rather than confrontation. The first emotional disruption does not arrive as jealousy, it arrives as realization. A quiet, internal recognition that something in the emotional dynamic has shifted without permission or preparation. The mind processes it slowly at first, almost refusing to give it full attention, because accepting it would mean accepting a change in control. There is a specific kind of awareness that begins to form, the sense that emotional availability is no longer centered around them. The expectation of being the primary focus, even in silence, no longer holds the same certainty. This creates a subtle internal pause, where old assumptions no longer match present reality. For an avoidant mind, this moment feels unfamiliar. They are used to emotional distance being their decision, their timing, their structure. But now, something external has changed the pattern. Attention is no longer paused in the same way. Emotional energy is not simply waiting in the background anymore, it is moving elsewhere. The most unsettling part is not the presence of someone else, it is the shift in availability. The realization that emotional space once assumed to be steady is no longer guaranteed. You are not emotionally paused, you are not emotionally suspended. You are continuing forward in a direction that no longer revolves around them. This is where awareness begins to deepen. Small details start to carry meaning they did not carry before. The idea that someone else is now witnessing your value creates an internal disruption, not because it is openly threatening, but because it changes the exclusivity of emotional perception. They are no longer the only silent observer of your presence. The mind tries to process this without emotional reaction at first. It labels it as irrelevant, temporary, or unimportant. But beneath that mental labeling, something more grounded is forming, a recognition that access is no longer automatic. Emotional space is no longer reserved, and attention is no longer anchored in one direction. Jealousy in an avoidant system does not usually appear in an open or direct form. It does not announce itself, it does not get acknowledged. It moves inward immediately, where it is filtered, minimized, and reinterpreted into something more acceptable for their emotional defenses. The feeling is not allowed to fully surface, because that would mean vulnerability, and vulnerability is something they have trained themselves to avoid. Instead of recognizing jealousy, the mind quickly assigns it a different meaning. It becomes not important, not relevant, or not worth attention. This internal rewriting happens almost automatically. It is not a conscious decision most of the time. It is a protective response designed to maintain emotional distance from discomfort. But suppression does not erase awareness. It only changes how it is expressed. Even when the emotion is denied internally, the attention begins to shift. Small details that were previously ignored start to stand out. Patterns become more noticeable. Presence becomes something they begin to register more carefully, even if they do not admit why. There is a quiet increase in observation. They start noticing who is around you. They start noticing changes in your attention, your energy, your availability. Not in an obsessive way, but in a subtle monitoring way that they would not label as emotional involvement. Yet the increase in awareness reveals that something has changed internally. At the same time, the emotional denial remains strong. They continue to tell themselves that nothing has shifted, that it does not matter, that there is no reason for reaction. But beneath that mental repetition, behavior begins to adjust in small ways. Responses may become more calculated, distance may feel more intentional, silence may carry more awareness than before. What is unfolding is not the presence of jealousy in a direct sense, but the presence of attention shaped by suppressed emotion. The feeling does not disappear. It redirects itself into observation, into awareness, into a quiet internal monitoring that becomes more active than they would ever admit. When emotional discomfort begins to surface, the avoidant response rarely moves toward expression, it moves toward protection. The ego steps in as a shield, shaping behavior in a way that maintains the appearance of control. On the outside, everything is adjusted to look unchanged, calm, stable, unaffected. This is where acting unbothered becomes a strategy rather than a feeling. The behavior is carefully aligned to avoid revealing any internal disruption. The tone may become flatter, the responses may become shorter, the presence may feel more distant, not because interest has disappeared, but because exposure feels risky. The ego plays a central role in this shift. It does not allow space for emotional vulnerability to be seen as safe. Instead, it frames emotional reactions as weakness or loss of control. So anything that triggers discomfort is immediately redirected into behavior that reinforces independence. The goal is not connection in this moment. The goal is self-preservation. This is why distance often increases when internal tension rises. The mind interprets emotional activation as a signal to withdraw further. If feelings are becoming noticeable, then separation feels like the safest way to restore balance. The more something is felt internally, the more controlled the external expression becomes. What appears as indifference is often a carefully constructed emotional defense. The absence of visible reaction is not proof of absence of feeling, it is proof of effort to conceal it. Every action is adjusted to avoid giving away what is happening beneath the surface. Even small interactions begin to carry this shift. There is more restraint in tone, less openness in engagement, a stronger emphasis on neutrality, all of it designed to maintain the image of being unaffected, even when internal awareness is doing the opposite. The ego does not allow emotional exposure easily. It prioritizes protection over honesty in moments where feelings become difficult to manage internally. At a certain point, the internal system stops feeling stable. The emotional structure that once relied on distance and control begins to show tension. Two opposite forces start to operate at the same time, each pulling in a different direction, creating a quiet form of inner pressure that is difficult to ignore. One part of the mind continues to repeat the familiar belief, the belief that nothing has changed, that emotional distance means emotional safety, that detachment is still working as intended. This part insists on maintaining the same identity of being unaffected, unchanged, and in control of personal emotional space. But another part begins to react differently. It does not argue loudly, it questions quietly, it registers discomfort that does not fit into the existing framework. It notices that certain thoughts are appearing more often, it recognizes that attention is shifting in ways that were not expected, and it begins to ask questions that do not align with the usual internal narrative. This is where the contradiction becomes noticeable. The same situation is being processed in two completely different ways inside the same mind. One side is trying to maintain emotional distance, the other side is already emotionally engaged at a subtle level. Neither side fully dominates, which creates a constant internal push and pull. The result is not immediate emotional expression, it is internal tension, a sense of unease that does not have a clear label. There is awareness without acceptance, reaction without acknowledgement. Awareness begins to rise, but it is immediately met with resistance from the part of the mind that wants to stay unaffected. This internal division creates discomfort because it removes the simplicity of emotional detachment. Nothing feels fully resolved inside. Thoughts do not settle in one direction. Instead, they circulate between denial and recognition, creating a mental environment that feels unsettled without a clear reason. The shift becomes most noticeable when access is no longer assumed. Not emotional control, not attention, but access itself. The idea that your presence, your time, and your emotional availability are no longer automatically aligned with them, creates a deeper internal reaction than any surface-level emotion. There is a quiet recalibration that happens. The mind starts to register that the previous pattern of availability is no longer in place. There is no longer an unspoken expectation that emotional space will remain open in the same way it once was. That assumption begins to dissolve without confrontation. This is not processed as jealousy at first. It is processed as absence of access. A subtle awareness that connection is no longer freely available on demand. The emotional door that once felt partially open, even in distance, now feels redirected elsewhere. Inside this realization, something shifts in the way attention is interpreted. It is no longer just about presence or absence, it becomes about direction. Your emotional energy is no longer circling around one person. It is moving forward. It is being seen. It is being acknowledged in another space. That awareness introduces a form of internal resistance, not because of loss alone, but because of replacement. Someone else is now part of the emotional equation. Someone else is receiving attention that was once assumed to be exclusive or stable. The mind does not immediately accept this as emotional loss. It processes it as a change in structure. But beneath that rational framing, there is a quiet recognition that access is no longer guaranteed. The sense of emotional proximity that once existed has been altered. There is also a growing awareness that effort is no longer enough to assume presence. Emotional connection is no longer something that exists by default. It now requires presence, timing, and mutual direction that cannot simply be taken for granted anymore. The response to emotional discomfort rarely moves outward in an avoidant pattern, it moves inward. Instead of approaching the situation or expressing uncertainty, there is a deeper retreat into silence. The external behavior may remain controlled, but internally, the emotional activity begins to increase in intensity. This withdrawal is not emptiness, it is a shift into internal processing. The distance becomes a space where thoughts start to multiply without interruption. There is no external release, so everything stays inside, cycling through different interpretations and possibilities without resolution. At this stage, the mind begins to explore scenarios that were previously ignored or dismissed. Questions start to appear that challenge the earlier sense of control. Thoughts about loss begin to surface quietly, not as panic, but as subtle awareness that something has changed in the emotional structure. There is also a growing sense of uncertainty that was not present before. The belief in emotional stability through distance starts to feel less absolute. The internal narrative that once supported detachment begins to include doubts that were previously filtered out. Even so, these thoughts do not translate into immediate action. There is still resistance to emotional exposure. The idea of reaching out or expressing concern feels uncomfortable, even when internal tension is rising. This creates a gap between thought and behavior. Inside that gap, the emotional spiral continues. Awareness increases, but expression remains blocked. The mind continues to revisit the same ideas from different angles. Concern grows slowly, but it stays contained within internal reflection rather than outward movement. The result is a silent escalation, more thought, more questioning, more internal awareness, but still no direct response. The emotional experience becomes active inside, while outward behavior continues to appear controlled and unchanged. Expression is often the first thing that gets filtered out in an avoidant emotional system. Not because there is nothing to express, but because expression itself is perceived as risk. The internal priority is not emotional honesty in the moment, it is emotional safety. Vulnerability is processed as exposure rather than connection. The idea of showing internal feelings creates discomfort that feels more immediate than the discomfort of holding those feelings inside. So even when emotions become strong enough to be noticed internally, they are rarely translated into words or visible action. There is a consistent internal calculation happening. If something is expressed, it becomes visible. If it becomes visible, it can be responded to. If it can be responded to, it can be judged, rejected, or misunderstood. That chain of possibility creates resistance before expression even has a chance to form. Because of this, silence becomes the default response. Not silence as absence, but silence as protection. It is a way to keep emotional experience contained within internal boundaries where it cannot be affected by external reactions. This containment feels safer than the unpredictability of openness. Even when feelings intensify internally, the external behavior remains controlled. The gap between inner experience and outer expression becomes wider. Thoughts may become more active, awareness may increase, but nothing is allowed to cross into visible communication if it risks emotional exposure. This is why direct expression rarely happens in moments of emotional activation. The fear of being seen too clearly outweighs the urge to be understood. Silence becomes a buffer that prevents emotional vulnerability from reaching the outside world, even when the internal experience suggests movement is happening beneath the surface. What remains is an emotional state that is fully present internally but carefully restricted externally, where feeling exists without expression and awareness exists without disclosure. The shift reaches a point where internal denial can no longer fully match external reality. The emotional structure that relied on assumption begins to face a different kind of clarity. What was once taken for granted no longer exists in the same form. The sense of automatic emotional positioning is replaced by something more uncertain and unfamiliar. There is a quiet recognition that access is no longer default. The presence that once felt steady, even in distance, now feels redirected. Emotional attention is not anchored in the same place anymore. It is moving in a direction that no longer centers around them, and that change begins to register more deeply over time. This is not a dramatic realization. It does not arrive in a single moment of shock. It builds gradually through observation, through small signs that accumulate into a larger understanding. The idea that emotional space is now shared, or even fully shifted, starts to settle into awareness. Another presence reflecting your value introduces a new emotional dynamic. It changes the internal reference point they once used. Attention that was assumed to be stable now feels comparative. The emotional landscape is no longer singular. It now includes an external validation that exists outside of their influence. Inside this realization, internal resistance starts to weaken. The earlier confidence in emotional detachment begins to feel less absolute. The belief that distance ensured control no longer aligns with what is unfolding. Something has moved beyond their ability to influence or reset. The emotional impact becomes more noticeable at this stage, not through expression, but through awareness, through the understanding that the previous emotional position is no longer guaranteed. The structure they once relied on is no longer intact in the same way, and that creates a deeper internal adjustment that continues to unfold silently. In the end, the most important truth is not about loud reactions or visible emotions. It is about awareness. Avoidants do not usually react in extreme ways when things are happening in real time. They stay composed. They maintain distance. They protect their image of control. But underneath that silence, understanding develops in a very different way. The real shift happens when they start to realize they were never as detached as they believed. The emotional connection they thought they had controlled begins to feel more real in its absence. And when another person starts showing interest in you, it does not simply trigger jealousy, it creates awareness, a deeper recognition that emotional space has changed and access is no longer the same. That awareness can be powerful, but it is often delayed. It arrives after distance has already grown, after emotional direction has already shifted, after the connection they assumed would always be there no longer feels guaranteed. And in many cases, that realization does not come early enough to change the outcome, because by the time it fully settles in, the emotional timing has already moved forward. You are no longer in the same emotional place. The connection is no longer centered in the same way, and what they finally begin to feel internally may no longer match where you are emotionally at that point. If this video gave you clarity about avoidant behavior and the hidden emotional patterns behind it, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to the channel as well, because more content like this is coming that will help you understand these dynamics on a deeper level and see through the silence people often misunderstand.